and gentlemen, when I say the words blah, 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 what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Is the right answer. Greta Thunberg, indeed. Yes, the Swedish teenager and environmental activist Greta Thunberg's rallying cry reminding us that actions speak louder than words. Time and time again, we have seen many politicians pay lip service to the issue of climate change. And despite a series of conferences on the topic, not much has changed. Ladies and gentlemen, we have gathered here today to root out blah, 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 and move the conversation on. And I'm going to pick the forthcoming panel's brains to identify how we can carve out solutions. Please welcome to the stage Ms. Susie Perez-Quinn, Chief of Staff at NASA. Mr. Joseph Aschbacher, Director General of the European Space Agency. Dr. Richard Spinrad, Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere and NOAA Administrator. Koji Terada, Vice President of the Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency. And please welcome back on stage Espen Barde Eide, Norway's Minister of Climate and Environment. Now, before I begin, I would like to ask all the audience to give me a show of hands. I'm going to ask you two questions. The first one is, how many of you think that governments care enough about climate change? Wow, plenty of cynicism I detect here. Okay, my second question is, how many of you believe we can reduce the increase of our planet's temperature? That's more like it. Good, good. So, Dr. Spinrad, I'm going to start my first question with you. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, has warned that water is at the heart of the climate crisis. And the damage already caused by climate change is making our planet uninhabitable. The current trajectory does not bode well. Let's get real. In your work with NOAA, which is an environmental intelligence agency, how would you describe the current state of the Earth in a few sentences? And if we continue as we are, how will things end up a decade from now?
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for the opportunity here this morning to talk about these critical issues. I think, in short, the answer is deeply threatened by any measure that the situation with respect to the ecosystems, situation with respect to the physical nature of the Earth is one where, if we don't take steps, as we've known for some time, we'll only continue on this trajectory that forebodes fundamental changes to our lives, to our lifestyles, to our quality of life. However, I feel very confident, especially in a room like this, where we're surrounded by technologists, scientists, policymakers, that with the kind of understanding that we are developing through the use of remote sensing, through the advanced use of high-performance computing, we can actually be climate realists and therefore climate optimists. If we really get a handle on understanding the changes that are before us right now and improve the predictability of these changes, we can then take the steps necessary to mitigate and adapt to those changes. So whether it's the water impacts in terms of flood, drought, I would also add, if you include saltwater in that definition, the impacts on fisheries, the impacts on coral reefs, the impacts on the ecosystems in the ocean, the answer will be to have a much improved and skillful capability for predicting and projecting what the changes will be, and using the concept of a digital twin, what the changes that we undertake will have on climate of the future.
Thank you. Minister Eide, you saw how the audience reacted. There's very little faith in governments. Aside from being the Norwegian Minister for the Environment, you also have served as a foreign minister. In your dialogue with international governments, is there a sense of urgency to tackle climate change, or have the current global financial challenges lowered these issues on their list of priorities? Do you feel that they know enough? And does the infrastructure of space funding sufficiently spread to reach all those affected, including, say, the end user, like a fisherman in the Maldives?
Okay, those are several good questions in one. But do care? Well, I agree with the audience that governments obviously have not cared enough. So that's obviously true. But governments care much more now, and over the last years, you've seen very concrete steps. If you look at the European Green Deal, which is now taking the UN goals and transforming them into real action, we're part of that as a close associate with the EU. What the US government is now doing with the IRA and a lot of other regulatory moves, there is now a systemic effect to actually transform the economy into something that is climate friendly, nature positive. It's not too late. It's late. It's late in the day. We should have done this 30 years ago because we already knew enough. At least from a precautionary principle, we should have done more, but there is much more action now. And just this weekend in Japan, incidentally, there was the G7 meeting of heads of state and government. And if you look at the declaration that came out from there, it's very strong on all the issues I mentioned. Very strong on climate, very strong on the need to decarbonize everything, to basically get all out of fossil fuel. Very strong on nature preservation, very strong on the need to build policies on science. And I think this declaration would not be so strong on these things even 5 years ago. So there is something happening. So I disagree with Greta Thunberg when she says it's all blah, 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 because the carbon intensity of most stuff in the industrialized world has gone radically down. So all industrialized economies have peaked. Our emissions are going down, not up, although the economy is growing. And the economy is, twice as big in most of our countries since 1990. Emissions are lower than 1990. But it's not good enough because we should cut more, and we should also make sure the technology is available to those countries that are now emerging, so that the gains of the industrialized world is not undermined by the fossil developments of the emerging countries, which is also something that we work on. So it's a complex big answer. I think I subscribe to Greta and her generation's critique of not enough action, but it's simply wrong to start by saying that it's all blah, 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 because I think the work that's going on now is getting quite serious. And that's exactly why you need this data, which comes to your last point, that we need to make sure that all the knowledge we now have can be transformed into something usable, accessible, and relevant in the life of local fishermen and women and local farmers and people who are now discovering a very fast-changing world, where the experience they gain from their mothers and fathers is not as relevant any longer because the world they're living is changing, just in front of them. And that's why we need to make sure that data is accessible.
Thank you. I now turn to Ms. Quinn. It's been 35 years since the NASA scientist Dr. James Hansen testified to Congress about climate change. In your experience of working for the US Senate and in your current role with NASA, you have persuaded the Senate to take decisions in the wake of various climate catastrophes. How challenging was it getting people in power on side?
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. That takes me back to one of the last times the US Congress did something on comprehensive energy before the Inflation Reduction Act, and that was in 2007. And that was very, very, very challenging. There was obviously a new administration in town, and they wanted to tackle this issue, and they did. We changed the fuel economy standards for cars. That had not been done in years. And that might sound like a blah or a nothing right now. It does make a difference. There are cars on the road now that stop when they idle versus burning emissions and running. There are electric cars on the road now that were not on the road 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So things have changed. So we did make progress on energy policy. I think where we hit a wall was on the regulatory construct of how you would address greenhouse gases. You would think that the Clean Air Act would be the place to do it. And back then that was the thinking. It's not. So I think it's moved on to a ground level individual response. If you, again, look at the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the benefits are to individuals to buy electric cars. The benefits are to individuals and families to purchase energy efficient appliances for their homes. That's the attempt to move the needle. On the government side, in that landmark legislation, there's investment in many, many different types of energy. So I think the will is there. Where I see a gap and what I want to hear more about at this conference, the blat to me is the way we talk about space-related data is boring. We need to meet people where they are, and the most powerful way to present the data, we need to listen to them, but it's also visualization. It's showing people a graphic depiction of what sea level rise looks like, what it's looked like in the past 50 years, what those projections look like for the future. That is how you tell the story, and you also educate. If you show ocean temperature over 10 years, ocean temperature over 50 years, that is a way to make the information not blah, and what I think we need to do more work as policymakers on.
Thank you. I want to bring Mr. Aschbacher into this. The ESA is such a huge player with the success of Copernicus. How did the EU and the ESA jointly approach the Copernicus program? And how did it materialize? And how has it affected what we know about the planet?
No, that's a very good point, a very good question. First of all, I think what we have been always good at in Europe is taking climate change as a major policy guideline and really follow through, and we have done it on the ground since many decades. Greater, of course, is the new generation, but I can say since the 70s and 80s, climate change has been a big issue for politics across Europe and across the world, but also in particular across Europe. I look at a minister from Norway, one of the very strong climate advocates, to make sure that we do whatever we can in order to sustain our planet, to ensure a future for our next generation, and therefore use all the means we have at our disposal. So now coming to space, and Copernicus, as you mentioned, was born in the late 90s. In 1998, we are celebrating 25 years, actually just in a couple of days this year. 25 years it took until Copernicus developed into what it is today, one of the, I would say, most powerful data observation systems in the world, together with NASA, together with JAXA, together with many other providers of data, but really to have a complete set of data and information that is being provided. But I'm talking here late 90s, when that was actually one of the very few remaining from that period when we initiated, at that time was called GMES, which is now Copernicus. When we initiated it, we spent about 5 years to not develop a satellite or define a satellite, but to ask users what is needed in order to have the right satellite technology data dissemination. So we really consulted for 5 years, developing services and applications with users. And I still remember an early meeting we had in, I think it was around 2000, a room full of people called a user forum. And somebody, the moderator, your equivalent of the time, was asking, in this room of a few hundred people, who is a real user? A real user, raise your hand. And there were 5 or 6 users out of 500 people, showing that at that time, the users were not engaged at all. And this was a warning sign for us, at least from the space side, that we have to make sure that we get the users on board. And that's why we developed these services over several years until about 2005, when the first satellite decision was made to develop the first satellite. Today, this is now many years afterwards, I think it is fair to say it is a very powerful tool to take the pulse of our planet, to really measure everything you can imagine, the atmosphere, the oceans, the land surface, the ice caps, how the Earth's system interacts, and understanding climate. And I think it's also fair to say, and I'm looking here at NOAA in particular, it's fair to say that without this data, we would not understand climate change as we understand it today, with the precision, with the accuracy, and also being able to make forecasts on where we go on climate with this precision without these data. So we do need these data, absolutely, in order to understand climate change. Of course, the next step is to act upon and take measures. And this, maybe a last word, since you asked how the European Union and ESA put this together. I think it's a good example. where the institutions in Europe work extremely well together and put their energies together in a very complementary way. ESA, my agency, is a space agency, so we develop the requirements, we develop the satellites, the data dissemination system, and the European Union provides the services and the political stability, but also a good portion of the funding. Some of it comes from ESA, but the majority from the European Union. And I think this is really a strength which we have put together here, compliments to the colleagues and friends who have been making this possible. And today, I think it is certainly something that contributes in the global context, together with all the other space agencies, to make sure that we do, from a space point of view, what we can in order to understand, and therefore, in the future, mitigate climate change.
So we've talked about Europe, but now I'm going to turn to Asia. To Radisson, during the past 20 years of your career, you have established several innovative satellite missions with domestic and international partners. Can you give us some examples of international collaborations on climate-related disasters with the use of Earth observation satellites in the Asia-Pacific region? And why, in your opinion, is international cooperation among space agencies so necessary? And do you feel that it goes far enough?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Regarding the international cooperation, particularly in the Asia-Pacific countries, I would like to mention our activity, Sentinel-Asia. The Sentinel-Asia was launched in 2006 among to improve the response to disaster in the Asian Pacific region by utilizing space technologies. Currently, there are 111 member organizations, including space agencies, disaster management authorities, and international organizations. It responds to disasters. Space agency, including JAXA, conduct emergency observation using their own satellite. Research institute transform satellite data into information on damages. And disaster management organization use information for disaster management activities. This is an example of the international cooperation. In this case, international cooperation among space agencies could increase the frequency to observe disaster impact area. In addition, the space agency cooperation could help the reach out to disaster management authorities in the region. And as for the inter-agencies cooperation, more than 20 years ago, I was involved in the creation of the Earth-Care mission, which is currently being developed in collaboration with ESA. For the Earth-Care mission, so ESA will provide the satellite and the launch vehicle and also some observation instrument, including LiDAR. JAXA will provide cloud profiling radar, which can monitor the vertical structure and motion of clouds by the Doppler velocity observation. So Earth-Care satellite has capable of observing cloud and aerosol at the same time. So I think it is essential for space agencies. I think it is essential for space agencies to develop using their own specialized technologies and cooperate in operation and share satellite data. I think Earth-Care is also a good example and answer to the question of why so international cooperation is necessary.
Thank you. So I return to you, Mr. Aschbacher. Space technology appears to be the preserve of wealthy nations, and they are also responsible for the most emissions. But what sort of actionable solutions are developing nations receiving? Like, typically, what would happen when a country like, say, Pakistan or the Democratic Republic of Congo suffers from a climate disaster? When do you come in? And what's the typical plan of action, and what sort of discussions take place?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of discussions that take place, but maybe just to understand your question properly. If you say that they are the main emitters, I assume you mean the developed nations,
yes.
not the satellites
yes.
or the technology.
Yeah.
But yes, what we do is actually there's a lot of frameworks and opportunities that we offer. On one side, come back to the Copernicus data. The data are free of charge to anyone in the world, so free and open data policy. And I think that is a very important way of making sure that the data are being used by everyone who needs them. Today we are disseminating about 300 terabytes of data every single day to the world, many of them outside Europe, because people need this data on a daily basis. You mentioned the disaster in Pakistan or in Africa and the Republic of Congo. In these cases, if there's a disaster happening, we have several mechanisms. One is called the Charter on Natural Disasters, where agencies or the United Nations on behalf of developing countries can call on the Charter, that means on the space agencies, to use their satellites, point them, that means take observation of the area which is affected through flooding, fire, or whatever the disaster is, and they commit that they provide this data for free to these countries or the Civil Protection Agency. So there's this network in place. In Europe, you have also Copernicus Emergency Service that in addition develops services, that means added value, information that the fireman or the flood protection agent needs on the ground. So there's a lot happening in this. We also have quite a number of international projects with the World Bank. We have a project with the European Commission in Africa, for example, but also in other parts. So there's a lot happening. But just to say it in a few words, I think with space we have a unique tool that can really help not only the developed countries, as you said, but really every single nation. And this is a great asset, and I think this is something that we really are committed to do. Personally, I've initiated a number of projects in order to achieve that. They got very good funding from our member states to make sure that these data are used in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, wherever there is a need for it for a crisis, and they can have this data for free, but also with expertise which we can offer.
So as I understand it, the nations are notified, the relationship starts after the disaster rather than before the disaster, am I right? Surely the goal is that they should have that information in advance. They should be able to disseminate it so that it doesn't get to a point where lives are lost.
Fully agree, and this is part of another project or other projects that we're having to build up infrastructure in these nations. We have cooperation agreements with the regions that they have receiving units capable of taking the data and disseminating them to these sources, including, by the way, with training which is offered to use it to build up the capacity. So you're absolutely right. It's not only when the disaster happens, but really to prepare them well in order to be ready, and therefore with local means use the data where they need them. So absolutely, and there again, this is something where I think the world works pretty well together. This is different agencies, look at the space agencies, but also the World Bank is quite active, and we work with them pretty well. Also other development agencies are pretty engaged in this, and of course we should always do more, I fully agree, but I think the mechanisms are there. But to avoid the blah blah, you're fully right. I think we have to certainly intensify our efforts.
Ms. Quinn, there are new entrants to the market as well, to the space market, such as commercial entrepreneurs. Do you think that there's a need for greater regulatory sort of framework in the space sector?
There's a lot of work going on right now with this administration on basically space traffic, space situational awareness. So I would say stay tuned, but there is definitely a broad understanding of it. There's a lot more going on in space, not just the satellites that all of these agencies are familiar with that have been conducting Earth observations for decades, big, very complex, very bespoke instruments. There are now constellations up there. And there are constellations up there to provide telecommunications, which is also incredibly important during a natural disaster. If you have a remote area and you can't get Wi-Fi, you can rely on Wi-Fi from space in some situations. I think we've seen that. Ukraine is a very good example. So. It is more crowded, though, so we want to make sure that there aren't conflicts when we're launching new instruments as well. So, yes, it is needed. The addition of commercial entrants into the marketplace, though, there's constellations of Earth-observing satellites up there now, and they can see things at a precision that maybe our instruments cannot. When you layer them together, it's really, really powerful information. So, yes, regulation is needed. Yes, we need those entrants to the market. And it just gives us more access and more understanding of what's going on with the planet.
The reason I ask about regulation is that the sort of template that's been established is that there is free-for-all data available. And if there are sort of commercial interests, and that data might be monetized. So on a global scale, also, my second question is, on a global scale, is the lack of accessibility standing in the way of policies being enacted to understand the impact of essential climate variables?
So I would say we have a ton of information. We receive and we transmit NASA terabytes of information a day. It's a lot. It's making that information available and accessible, meeting people where they are at the individual level, at the country level, in a way that is useful and understandable to them. That is the challenge. It's not so much what do we have and can you buy it or not, because if we're buying it in some way, we're making it publicly available. Informing the decisions with some of these users, perhaps of commercial data, there are probably effects from their use of it and how it might impact their employees, how it might impact their business, how it might impact their behavior in the US and abroad. So I think there's more benefit than not to having more entrants in the marketplace and more accessibility than what we've had before. It's the understanding and again, meeting people where they are with that information.
Thank you. Minister Ida.
If I may come on this, because the same way in what we're doing with this NICFI initiative of satellites on forest, is that we buy the data, and we buy them from private actors, and then we make them available. And basically, this is sort of forest-oriented. It's 30 degrees south, 30 degrees north of equator, particularly focusing on selected countries, which this is most relevant. And the governments get them, the NGOs and indigenous people, public media get them. So you can use them whether you want to direct your police to stop sort of illegal forest fires that are, put up by people, or whether you want to criticize your government for not doing it. So this is becoming public domain because we do it. And we have financed this so far. We are very positive about this. Somebody else would like to contribute, we'll be welcoming more contributors. But I think making this public is also a global public good that governments can contribute to. That's not actually regulation. It's basically just buying it and putting it on the market, and it's very useful. And when we work together, we both have long-term trends, because you have very serious long-term data series, but you also have almost real-time, at least sort of with a day lag maybe, but almost real-time data about changes that you can react to on this front, which is one of many arenas that we can use satellite data.
In your dealings with international governments, do you feel that they understand the dedication of resources needed to fund time and finances to such projects where they plan their budgets for space integration in tackling climate change?
I think the honest answer to that is more than before and less than they should.
It's a bit of a way to go then.
But we're on the right track. I think there's if I may just, we're now in COP28 in Dubai, which is a particularly important climate conference because it's the first global stock take. Means that when we were in Paris, we said we will meet again in what was supposed to be 7 years, then we had COVID, so it was 8 years, and then say, how are we doing? And of course, we know the short answer, we're doing badly, but we need a much more granular and detailed answer to how are we actually doing. And so far, that has largely been based on individual countries reporting. And that reporting might be very good or not so good, might be very honest or maybe not so honest, and some countries would like to, but simply doesn't have the capacity. So adding sort of a layer of satellite data to check in appropriate manner, the data we get from individual countries will be very helpful as we try to build up a real understanding of what we're actually doing, because then we build our predictions, so how we're doing are very much based on self-declaration, and I'd like to see that that's good, but we need to add to that some kind of more sort of physical observation of the real atmosphere, because there is actually just one atmosphere at the end of the day, even if the land are divided into separate countries.
Thank you. Dr. Spinrad, you served as NOAA's chief scientist under President Obama, who remains highly invested in raising awareness of climate change. But a lot has changed since then. How has the dawn of artificial intelligence technology changed the way data is being condensed and disseminated? And how has it helped in forging partnerships with international collaborations?
So start by pointing out that all of my talking points were prepared by ChatGPT this morning. There's obviously a lot of different perspectives on the role that artificial intelligence and machine learning play in terms of applications for climate change. And while the prospects are daunting, I think the important point is we're going to have to make a number of different decisions about priorities for investment, even at the level of what observations should we make. What are the highest priority observations, either through remote sensing or in situ? And so there are opportunities to use advanced decision-making tools, and I would put AI in that category, to help us prioritize investments. I also believe that the applications of things like AI are going to help us improve our prediction capability, where we can, instead of, if you will, taking the brute force approach that we historically have taken with model development, where we will build a model and then run it 10,000 times, changing the initial conditions, or run 10 different models to see what the average looks like, we can be a lot smarter with the application of AI and ML to figuring out where the best models are, where they work best, and where the projections are most skillful. So I see a lot of prospects. I also believe that the global community has a lot of work to do with respect to constraining where, when, and how we use some of these very powerful new tools like AI. But I'm, again, optimistic that we can do that in a way that also takes advantage of working with users. So we talked earlier about understanding the needs of communities. That's a challenge. In the United States, we have over 500 Native American tribes. We need to make sure we are attending to the needs of those tribes in terms of climate products and services. How might AI and ML help us address those needs from a very diverse user community?
Well, we've been warned by Goldman Sachs that we're all going to be out of jobs soon because of AI, and some of the big tech giants have also warned us to be very mindful of it getting bigger than us. What do you think the main sort of threats are? Could it fall into the wrong hands and take over our lives?
Yes, to a certain extent, but I could say that about every technology. If you look at the original concerns about cell phone technology and wireless communications, there were a lot of concerns about abuse. I think this is where governments play an important role, and especially working with the strong, good players in the private sector about what are the boundary conditions, what are the terms of reference, what are the things we have to watch out for with respect to abuse of a particular technology. And again, I think this is not a unique problem to any particular nation. So the global community, through a variety of different international organizations and intergovernmental organizations, can help define what are the warning signs of abuse of a technology. And again, I myself believe there is nothing particularly unique or insidious with respect to the use of AI, ML. It is another technology that we have to be aware of in terms of its potential, both for good applications and bad.
Thank you. To Radisson, you have overseen the deployment of Earth observation satellites at the Japanese Exploration Agency. I understand that under your leadership, JAXA has also been utilizing AI. It has incredible capabilities, but do you perceive any risks? What is your perception, and do you consider it a friend or a foe?
Yeah, so AI is a powerful and convenient technology to deal with a huge amount of Earth observation data. So AI should be a friend. On the other hand side, we need to avoid its potential risk of misinformation, especially intentionally created misinformation. To mitigate the risk, so we should do verification of information produced by the different AI systems.
Thank you. Minister Eide, what are your concerns as a politician about AI?
I think it's been well answered. I mean, it's like any technology can be used in both directions. The same technology gave us nuclear power and nuclear weapons. I mean, I prefer the former to the latter. So it's very much about government interaction, regulatory limits, but also we really need to use massive amount of data in a smart way. And any technology that helps us with that is basically a good thing. when we understand the climate systems of the world are incredibly complex. And if I may just 20 seconds, the predictions and the early models of climate change was almost spot on global warming and the relationship between emissions and global warming, and it followed very much the right trajectory. The effects on the climate system is worse now that we have empirical data than was calculated, because we were not able to have sufficiently complex climate models about everything, water streams and melting ice and the effect of melting ice on the equator and all this. And we really need to understand that. And I'm sure all this new data processing capacity and artificial intelligence can help us. But of course, there may also be malign uses, and we need to be aware of both. So I'm a technology optimist, but I always think it's good to think about what you do when you use technology.
Speaking of technology, do you think more players need to be invited to the table to actually disseminate the data, which is so difficult for so many to understand? Space is quite intimidating for people who don't understand it, who don't work in the industry. It's quite overwhelming. Do you feel, Ms. Quinn, that more technology integration is required to make it accessible to the end user in a way that perhaps hasn't been established just yet?
Yes, it's a highly specialized field, very focused on certain types of observations, certain types of instruments. It's the translating of the data back to people, back to tribes, back to levels of government that I think we need some help with. Also, social sciences. We're just talking about AI. Think about all the other information that people are deluged with on a daily basis. And how do they factor in another stream of data? Where does it fit? What does it do to critical thinking? How does it affect trust of institutions and individuals? Those are things that are outside of the realm of physical and science and engineering. They're outside of the realm of rocket design. So we need to touch other disciplines, and I think we need to do it pretty quickly. It's probably going on somewhere. After this is done, I'm going to Google it. Maybe someone's going to come up to me and tell me that they're working this already. I hope to hear that. But there is a gap, and we need to bring in other disciplines and other areas of expertise. Also, when we're talking about climate, there's a lot happening now. The future is where a lot's going to be happening, and we need to make sure that we're understanding how younger people are dealing with this information now as well. I think that's a key element too.
To make it more accessible to the generations that are to come.
Yes, that are going to be dealing with projections that are pretty dire. They're going to be armed with more information, yet they could very well be feeling more stronger effects.
Can I just
Yes, of course.
Because I think if you want me to be concerned about something, here is my offer. I mean, exactly, it's not necessarily artificial intelligence, it's the algorithms in social media that makes people more extreme. And they were designed in such a way that if you were Googling for a dishwasher, you get more dishwasher announcers. That's just annoying, but I can live with it. But the problem is that when then this turned into politics, it has contributed to polarization in a very serious way. It was not necessarily by design, but that's the effect. And of course, for some people, it also became by design when they saw the effect of this tool. And I think the biggest challenge to science-based politics is not the absence of science, because we'll get the science, but the absence of trust in science, where people simply say, well, NASA tells me the Earth is round, but I don't think so because I think it's flat. And I don't really care that NASA says so because my friends say it's flat. There are more people now signing up to Flat Earth Society, which is probably not the biggest threat in the world, but just an example, right? So you really which is really a role of us politicians to treat each other and the scientific community as there are certain things that actually are true, and you cannot negotiate with biology or physics. It's just there. What we can do is to discover it and understand it better and work on it, and then we can disagree with other human beings on what the answer is, but not on what the reality is. And this is really so. If we meet again in 2050 and we failed, if we at all will be able to gather, of course, that's uncertain. It will not be because of science, physics, biologists who failed. It will be because politics failed, and that can partly be driven by algorithms in social media.
Can I comment on
Yes,
the
of course.
business of... we do spend a lot of time talking with ourselves in the environmental community and the remote sensing community, and there is an opportunity to take advantage of skill sets from very different communities, seemingly disparate communities, like the financial community, the medical and public health community, who also deal with prediction. They call it diagnosis, and they deal with large volumes of data. So there are opportunities for professional organizations, international organizations, to reach outside of their comfort zone and start having these discussions about use of data, development of prediction skills with the medical community, with the financial community. We need to do more of that.
Mm-hmm. But going back to my question about regulation, if we are talking about new players entering the sector, I assume there's going to be some sort of vetting needed, because if the information falls into the wrong hands and then it's manipulated and put out as, dare I say, fake news about what's going on with the climate, that could be dangerous, Mr. Aschbacher, couldn't it?
Well, that could be very dangerous, and certainly it happens. We have still lots of scientists who claim that they have evidence and they are doing studies and research that climate change doesn't exist. And I think probably in this room nobody would believe them, but there are still a lot of people outside. They have their followership, and they can certainly, I would say, attract some attention and therefore create some disturbance. But always you have to always ask a second question: why would they do that? What the interests are behind, and maybe there are some other vested interests behind why they act in this particular way. But let me pick up one point, and I think this is a very important one, which Mr. Spinrad was mentioning on digital twins and how we use them. I think what we have today, we mentioned some of the satellites and some of the projects. You mentioned EarthCare. Very happy to see it coming to space very soon. We have Copernicus, we have NASA satellites. All this is great, and we can well monitor our planet, take the pulse of our planet, as we say, but that's only data so far. Data becomes much more useful if you use them to simulate, to understand and to simulate the future. And the digital twin comes here in very, very nicely, not only from an Earth systems point of view, that you understand how the atmosphere interacts with the oceans, with the land surface, and with the polar regions, but also what does it mean for people? How does it affect people? If you have a flooding or sea level rise, how many people are affected potentially? What do you need to do in order for people's economies to help them mitigate? Of course, migration is a huge topic. So all these simulations which we can do to have what-if scenarios, which these digital twins allow us to do, I think is very powerful. And I think there we need to invest much more. I know that our colleagues in the US are working a lot, in Japan, also in Europe we are having digital twins that we are looking at our planet. Just to be very blunt, to simulate the planet and to really create a digital twin is impossible. This is a mammoth task that we will not be able to do for probably a very long period of time, despite powerful computers, despite better understanding, better observations. But we can simulate certain elements of it, climate aspects, deforestation, impacts of sea level rise and so on. And this we can do much better today than a couple of years ago. And I think this is what we need to do, to use this power of understanding and observations, combine it with very high power computing, high-performance computing, and make sure that we can simulate these situations, because that actually these threat scenarios are the frightening ones, and I think they should help our people to wake up, to avoid the blah, blah, blah you mentioned at the beginning, that because if we see that we surpass one of these tipping points, and then I think it gets really scary, and then I think we have really to take very serious action sooner rather than later. Yes.
So would you like to add anything to that?
It just is a reminder again that the Earth is really complex, and even when we're talking about sea level rise or we're talking about concentration of things in the atmosphere, we have to look at the system as a whole and how all of these things interact, and now humans and human behaviors interact. So to hear that there might be limits on the things that we can calculate and manipulate, I think that is interesting, because so far there haven't been guardrails around the technology. Governments are working on that, yet where do those capabilities end? So the Earth is very, very complex.
Indeed.
Can I point out that, with some optimistic points, I mean, we actually have some mechanisms that actually helps us to agree on what is true. And one example of that is the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, which is composed of thousands of researchers from all over the world, different cultures, who contribute and disseminate each other's work in a very scientific way, and then finally come up with the final report that they are behind. and which governments actually take seriously. At least they do so at the climate summits when they make explicit reflections back on what is said. I think that has been incredibly important for the obvious reason, because we need the knowledge, but also the fact that it's been developed in such a collaborative manner has increased the recognition that this is real and serious compared to if we did not have it. So last year I was president of the UN Environment Assembly, and we set up a third panel because we have one on biodiversity, and now we also are setting up a similar one on chemicals and waste, simply because we think the model of having this collective gathering and dissemination and presentation of data is good in a world where truth is increasingly fighting with false news or fake news.
That's something we deal with.
Yeah.
I'm a journalist by profession, so I know that well.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience now. So one of the questions is, and you can feel free to respond as I say them, how can space solve the climate crisis? I feel we've covered that, but monitoring is essential. But what can the space community do to mitigate?
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot to be done. They take mitigation. I mentioned before one example, which is sea level rise. Today we have the most precise satellites, by the way, together with NASA, Sentinel-6, which is measuring with millimeter accuracy the global sea level rise every day, so at global level. So of course we know what is the medium sea level rise, but also what would be the extremes that we can expect, because the extremes are the ones that flood your city or your area. There you can, of course, mitigate. And there you can build barriers, you can protect your coastlines, your cities. And I think there we can do actually a lot, because we have a very good understanding, a pretty good understanding of the average values, the extremes that can happen in case of storms or very strong meteorological events. And therefore, you can really save lives, and probably thousands of lives. You can certainly save lots of euros or dollars or yen to minimize damage. So I think there we can really do much more. Of course, we do it in certain, certain places. But this, I think, we need, and I come back to what you asked me before. I think in developing countries, there we need to reinforce these elements to help them much more with the means that we have and that we are already applying in the developed world.
Thank you. Would you like to add?
I'll give a very specific example. In the United States, more than 95% of our imports and exports come in or out of the country by sea, and we're not unique in that regard. The ability to use remote sensing tools and predictive tools to optimize the ship track route can result in dramatic reductions in the use of fuels. And so in the interim, as we're getting to net zero shipping, the ability to reduce by tens of percents how much fuel is used by the commercial shipping industry is a very important mitigative measure based on data and products derived from satellite.
How optimistic did all of you feel after COP27? Optimistic.
Not very.
A mix. I would say a mix. I mean, a COP itself is a very unique phenomenon, so I think kind of going in and understanding what to expect. The US presence, the amount of energy, the corporate attention was interesting. I don't know if we would have seen that 10 years ago, so I have a question mark on that piece. There are definitely more players around, but the process and the negotiators and what they're looking at, that doesn't, I don't know how much that's changed, but we are very much looking forward to this year's COP at NASA. And also, I think the findings of this conference, knowing that they will be used for subsequent conferences, including the COP, super important as well. It gives you a couple more dry runs and places to test what we learn, test the hypothesis, see what works, shake it around, and then deploy it on a larger world stage. So feeling mixed on last one, more optimistic going into this one.
I agree. The good thing that came out of Sharm el-Sheikh is this loss and damage fund. It was important for the global dialogue, North-South dialogue, to move on that, but we failed on improving our mitigation strategies in Sharm. But I am also very optimistic for this one. I think this is going to be a very important but also very serious COP. The UAE presidency is actually doing an excellent job in dealing even with one of the most thorny issues for them, which is energy transition, which they want to speak openly about, and we work closely with them. And it's also the first global stocktake. So I believe this will be a good one, but it has to be a good one, because if emissions do not peak or start to go down globally by 25, we will lose 1.5. Then there's no way. It's already hard, but there's no way if we don't really deal with it now, and that's basically the last COP that can give a serious impetus to that. What makes me optimistic is that in all leading industrial countries, we have governments now. Just think about I don't need to mention names, but just think of some of the people who were running very key countries 3 years ago. I mean, there's a much stronger dedication to this. It's much more shared in Japan, in North America, Canada, and US, in the whole EU with the Green Deal. And China is actually investing more in renewables every year than all other countries combined. So all sort of the motors of the world economy with their very different systems are now working on this track, and you better get on that or you will be lost in a fossil past that will not lead you to prosperity.
So Radisson, you wanted to add to that?
Yes, talking about the question from the audience. So for the mitigation of the disaster. So now, so one common challenge is to protect the people and the societies and society from increasing intensifying extreme weather event. More than 70% of global economic losses due to natural disasters caused by storm, flood, and drought. So flood have the highest impact in Asia. So for Asia, including Japan, how to manage water related to disaster is an imminent issue. So for addressing the issue, Japan is making effort to integrate different type of satellite data, ground data, and numerical model to forecast flooding areas. So due to global warming, the impact of extreme weather would be severer in the future. The satellite remote sensing data are utilized in the short-term prediction for local community to prepare extreme weather events.
Thank you. So with the work that you do with the World Bank, for instance, are there any kind of outreach programs to create training for countries where they need the information and they need to ingest it in some way? Are there such initiatives in place?
There are. I take an example of the cooperation we have with the World Bank. We have a program called GDA, Global Development Assistance, where we use our space means, couple them with funding from the World Bank, and spend them together on development projects where we know that space can play one role or one certain element in this development project. And training, yes, is a key element of this activity. We have a few others as well, EU for Africa, Tiger, and similar ones, but absolutely needed. But there I can only ask all around the table here and probably in the audience that there I think we need to do more. We have to reinforce these efforts. It's always a bit difficult to get funding and political momentum organized. I recognize the very strong leadership of Norway among the countries to really do that. But I think Norway is a good example. I hope many other countries would be the same way.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to return to the audience, and I'd request a show of hands. After what you've just heard from the panelists, do you feel that space can effectively help in tackling climate change? Well, that's good. Phew, that's a relief. Thank you. Sadly, we're almost out of time, but could each of you sum up in one sentence the way forward and what you'd like to relay to the audience having had this platform?
I would say we've covered a lot. Don't forget inspiration. I think that's one of the things that's unique to space agencies is the ability to inspire, particularly in human spaceflight and planetary travel. So a lot of what we've talked about has been stark. It's also been about empowerment and pathways to empowerment. Inspiration is key. It's a key ingredient. We've talked about cooperation a lot too, and open science and open data. Inspiration.
Thank you.
I borrow one phrase which the minister used in his introductory speech, which was mission control. Mission control, we have a problem here because our planet is under attack, literally, from ourselves, us people, and we need to establish a global mission control center that uses all the means at disposal, not only from space, but all the other means from artificial intelligence to cloud computing to digital twin models in order to make sure that we help everyone, and this is not only the developed nations, but really all the countries on the globe, because we are all in the same boat, in the same spaceship, and therefore I think we need to reinforce this effort. So I really like the phrase you mentioned, and I think we should be very serious about that.
Thank you. Dr. Spinrad?
I have 3 words. The first 2 I'll just mention and not elaborate: science and engagement as part of the solutions. The third word we've said very little about, and it actually comes back to where you started, and the word is youth. So we started with the perspectives of Greta Thunberg, but I would point out that there's an extraordinary movement among youth around the world. They are passionate, they are well-informed, they are organized, and bad on us if we are not taking better advantage of those who will inherit both the benefits and the downside of everything we've done. So I would strongly encourage all of us to take more seriously and actively the role of youth in the solutions.
Thank you. Radisson?
Yes. So satellites are monitoring changes of the entire globe continuously and consistently. The monitoring data and the findings from the data are improving future predictions. It enables us to address the challenges our society currently face and will face due to the climate change. So I'm convinced that remote sensing from space is an indispensable tool in realizing a sustainable society and enabling people to live a better future.
Thank you. And last word is yours, Ms.
We agree, I think, all of us, that space gives us an incredible toolbox, but as any toolbox, you need sort of clever craftsmen and women to use the tools in a smart way, and that has to do with access, relevance. And I agree, it has to do with sort of strengthening mission control's capacity, both to learn from science and facts and to act on what science and facts tells us.
Thank you. To sum up, I would like to say that space exploration focuses on the survival of humankind and the threats it faces. The fight against climate change has the same objectives. So perhaps through small collective strides in the right direction, we can work towards a greener world for Greta Thunberg's generation and beyond to inherit. Thank you very much to the panel, and thank you for your participation.